morning, everyone, and welcome to Panel 2, the Future of Work and International Migration. My name is Emma Winters. I'm the Communications Manager at the Center for Migration Studies. Before we get started with our second panel of the day, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items for anyone who's just tuning in. At any time during the panel, you can ask a question for the speakers. To do so, just type your question into the Q&A box below the video player. You can also contact CMS with any questions after the event by emailing cms@cmsny.org or tweeting at CMS New York. We will be recording the entire conference and we will share that recording with you after the event. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to the moderator of our second panel, Jacqueline Pavlon.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our panel discussion today on the future of work and international migration. I'd first like to thank the organizers of today and tomorrow's events, that Don Kerwin, the Executive Director of the Center for Migration Studies of New York, mentioned this morning, and all of the panelists of all of the sessions these 2 days for sharing their expertise with us. With me here today, we're fortunate to have the following 4 panelists, all of whom have done more and have more titles than I can list in this brief introduction. So first we have Ted Alden, who's a Bernard L. Schwartz Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and a visiting professor at Western Washington University. Ted is also a writer who's written several books and is currently a columnist for foreign policy and was formerly the Washington Bureau Chief of the Financial Times. Next, we have here with us Dr. Giovanni Perry, who is a professor of economics at UC Davis and director of the Global Migration Center. He's also a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research and is extensively published in academic journals and a receiver of research grants from several foundations, including the World Bank and the National Science Foundation, among others. Our third panelist is Dr. Ahmed Rahman, Associate Professor of Economics at Lehigh University and a Research Fellow at the Institute of Labor Economics. He was also previously a professor at the United States Naval Academy, and his research is focused on economic growth, economic history, economics of education, and of course, immigration. And finally, we have Dr. Peter J. Warren, Distinguished Research Fellow at the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto. Peter's currently leading an international research team for a joint project of the International Labor Organization and the Vatican on AI, robotics, and the future of work. He's also the chair of the Governing Council of Regis College, the Jesuit Graduate School of Theology at the University of Toronto, and was also named to the Order of Canada. And again, I'm Jacqueline Pavlon. I'm the Deputy Director of the Center for Migration Studies of New York that's been hosting this symposium today and tomorrow. So thank you so much, panelists, for being with us today. We really appreciate you taking the time to speak to everyone here. So today's session, again, is on the future of work and international migration. The COVID-19 pandemic has disrupted labor markets, supply chains, commerce, and it's also affected migration patterns and the adoption of technology alike. At the same time, the pandemic has made it very visible how important it is to rely on migrant workers to fill essential jobs in our economies. So while technology changes may influence the demand for migrant labor, it's somewhat circular because at the same time, the arrival of immigrants may impact the adoption of technology. And these changes in the labor market are going to depend upon the degree to which migrants and robots, if you will, are either substitutable in the labor market or if they are, on the contrary, complement one another. So our panelists today are going to discuss, what's going on in this relationship between the pandemic and technology and immigration. So thank you so much, panelists. I'm going to turn first to Giovanni. So could you maybe describe for us the trend of computerization in the United States and what the effect of that computerization has been on labor demand? And as a consequence, what types of jobs are or have been at risk of being automated away?
Thank you, Jacqueline, for having me here and for this panel. So yes, computerization has deeply affected the US economy in the last 30 years, and it has deeply changed the US labor market. So On one hand, computerization has increased dramatically the productivity and the demand for a set of jobs that use data analysis, computer information technology intensively. Jobs like software developers, coders, data analysts, but also biotech engineer, people who do data analysis in marketing. These are jobs whose demand has exploded because the productivity, the ability of really creating important services has become very large thanks to the computerization and information technology. These are jobs that use cognitive skills intensively and normally are done by people who have relatively high level of education. So these jobs were already relatively well paid, but with the introduction and the explosion of information technology, they have become even more in demand and in even higher paid. And given that they are a little bit at the top of the wage distribution, this is part of the reason why inequality or the success of people who were already highly educated and relatively wealthy has increased. Then computerization is also reduced and taken away some other jobs or replaced some type of jobs. These are jobs which economists call more routine, job that uses type of tasks that now are done by machine. So for instance, phone operator, cashier, bank teller, but all jobs that involve information gathering, secretary type of jobs, staff type of jobs. These have been made much less, or they have been replaced in a much larger scale by machine, computer, and information technology. And these are typically jobs that were in the middle of the wage distribution. So middle class, sometimes called, but middle income, certainly job. And the demand for this has declined significantly. Then there is a third type of jobs that actually the computerization and information technology has affected much less in terms of either increasing or decreasing their demand. Those are those type of manual jobs that need to be done in place, which are hard to be done by machine and needs to be done in a location. And many of them are done by relatively low educated jobs. So these are jobs like cook, like a waiter, like also elderly care, child care, but also household type of service, personal type of services. These have been affected less in the sense that they've neither been replaced in particular, nor they have been complemented too much by computerization. But with the growth of the top earner, maybe some of these services have, the demand for this has increased a lot. So this lower part in terms of the wage distribution of jobs, which are manual, which are done in place, maybe has increased in terms of demand because of the richer are demanding some more of these services, restaurant, household, and also the aging of the population has increased the demand for elderly care. So computerization has created what economists are calling sometimes the polarization of the labor market. At the top, more demand, more growth in wage. In the middle, less job, less growth in wage. And the bottom, also some increase in demand in wages. And in the last 20, 30 years, this has affected a lot the demand for labor. Let me say one last thing before we move on about how immigration already interacts a little bit with this. Immigrants for 30 years in the US have not been equally distributed among these jobs. They have been concentrated forever, but in the recent period even more, in the bottom and in the top of this job distribution that I have described. A lot of highly educated immigrants are so-called STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math jobs. They do math, they do engineering, they do science among the highly educated. And those jobs, as we have seen, have increased a lot in terms of opportunity, productivity, and demand. And a lot of non-college educated immigrants are instead doing those manual, sort of non-replaceable job by machines, such as childcare, elderly care, restaurant services. And so in a sense, immigrants already were and are, because of their skills, where demand has increased the most. And even more recently, sort of the interaction with these two, the interplay between demand and supply has become strong.
Thanks for that very, very clear-cut explanation. So if they're concentrated in the top and kind of bottom groups, would you say then that computerization has in net increased the demand for immigrants? And if so, what is the impact of those immigration flows? What has it been on native born workers in the labor market? How is it affecting their wages or the jobs they're taking?
Yes, so this is a very natural and important next question. So let me say two things. First, in terms of understanding how the recent inflow of immigrants in the US has been affected by this and has been impacted by this change in demand, I think we also need to think what is the US immigration policy. So I would say that a combination of changing labor demand and the American immigration policies have affected the inflow of immigrants in the last 20 years. In what sense? Well, at the high end of the skill spectrum, of the wage spectrum, those jobs which I said are science, technology, engineering, and math, high skilled, whose demand increased a lot, that has generated an inflow of relatively large number of immigrants. In fact, in the last 20 years, but dramatically in the last 10 years, immigration in the US has been extremely concentrated among college-educated STEM type of worker. A lot of them have come, and a lot of them are filling those jobs. Those other type of jobs for which demand also has probably increased, which are the manual, relatively low skilled, and that actually are done by immigrants who are already in the United States, however, have not generated a very big inflow in the last 10 years because there are not very many legal way of coming in the US if you are a non-college educated person and you have a job or you want a job in the US. And so immigration in the US in the last 20, but even more 10 years, has gone from being kind of U-shaped a little bit, U meaning a lot of immigrants at low skill, few in the intermediate and many in the high, to be just an upward slope. There are very few immigrants in the low and intermediate skill that have been in net in the last 20 years. And as a consequence, there is sometimes some shortages, and I guess in the post-COVID, the restaurant industry is an example, but the elderly care industry is a big example in which there are shortages of this type of jobs, in part due to the fact that the immigration laws have not sort of kept pace, I would say, with this. How did the interaction of technology and immigrants affect American wages? Well, as I just said, the fact that immigrants respond in part to the demand of jobs in the US makes them less of a direct competitor and more of a complement of Americans. So where there is an excess of demand for some type of job is there where immigrants can come in, where immigrants can take this visa and this job. But where Americans sort of, there is not such a shortage, is much less likely for them to come in. So already the fact that they come in response in large part to demand makes them more complementing, more filling some type of niche and skills which are not directly filled by American. But as I said, at the low end of the skill spectrum, ultimately, there might have been some shortage and there might be a continued shortages due to this very strong restriction that there is. So more complementarity than competition because of this feature of responding to demand, more at the high end than the low end for the feature of the immigration policies of the US, and in projection, maybe even more of this unbalance because computerization is going to continue, but also the demand for some of these local services because the population ages, because the population needs some of those is going to continue. I think it could be generating immigration pressure. Will it generate actual immigration? It will depend on the policies that we adopt.
Thanks. So I'm going to turn to Ahmed now, especially among some of those, high skilled jobs that Giovanni described as having cognitive skills. We've seen a shift in workplace arrangements during the COVID pandemic to be working from home. And so where do you see remote work fitting into the future of workplace arrangements? And what do you think that will mean for automation and innovation? As people are working from home, we've already seen a shift towards us on Zoom right now. So how is that going to continue? And, does it matter for productivity? Does it matter if employers are working from home or in an office? So I guess what do you think is going to be the future of work from home and how it's going to affect innovation and automation?
Yeah, thank you, Jacqueline. I think technologies always disrupt, especially these sort of workplace arrangements. But precisely how they're going to disrupt is often quite unclear. So let's take the last few decades and think of automating technologies, as you mentioned. Now, I think the computerization stuff that Giovanni was just mentioning is sort of a subset of that automation. And what automation? It's simply our ability to produce more and more stuff with less and less people, right? And this is everything from cars to computers, clothes, and like even cutlery, right? And many, many other goods. So far, however, these automating technologies haven't been quite adept at things like cutting our hair, or cleaning our teeth, or serving our meals, or educating our kids. These are things that still require humans. And so it's interesting that as these robots, again, more generically call them robots, as they produce more and more of our stuff, we're demanding not so much the stuff, but the actual services, right? So I think there's an interesting sort of irony here that the technologies that we're seeing, they're utilizing fewer and fewer humans. We as consumers are now demanding more and more from humans in order to do things such as cut our hair and teach our children, right? And so this is a little bit counterintuitive, but you can see this geographically. So it's interesting, regions such as Sheboygan, Wisconsin, or Union, South Dakota, places that have seen immense amounts of automating technologies in the last few decades. These are precisely the places that have also seen a big rise in the demand for unskilled, contact-intensive service work, right? So sort of an interesting development. This has been going on for quite some time. And then suddenly COVID strikes. And COVID has created, I think, a situation almost of a labor market epiphany among sort of two different groups of people. So one group of people suddenly woke up one morning and discovered, hey, I've been going to work 5 days a week. And it turns out I could have been doing all that stuff at home and have been just as productive, and maybe in some instances even more productive than I was when I was in the office. So that's interesting. And then you have another group who, to their dismay, find sort of the reverse epiphany. And that is, there isn't a single component of their job that they feel like they can do remotely. And if they try to do it remotely, try to carve out a little bit of space for them to have some flexibility in their workplace relationship, they find either that they're suffering a severe wage penalty or lose their employment, altogether. And so we know that this actually did happen during 2020. It's just interesting to see that, our measures of working from home, or the ability to work from home, actually correlate pretty strongly with individuals actually working from home when they had to during 2020. We can see this through tracktherecovery.org, a data set where you can actually, through GPS technology, see precisely what people are doing. And it seems to track exactly what we would predict actually quite well. So what we see then is sort of a sequence of automating technologies, which has created an increase in the demand for unskilled, highly contact-intensive employees. And then we have a working from home revolution that these individuals cannot partake in, right? And so I think what has happened is it's creating a sort of a new polarization in the labor market. It's new. It's not exactly related to skilled versus unskilled, although there's a lot of correlation there, but rather it's delineated by those who can work but be disconnected from their place of work and those who cannot do that, right? And so this is something quite new, and it's creating new labor dynamics, and it's ongoing as we speak. Now, one question for us is the latter group, Jacqueline, as you asked, is this group more productive, right? Is it truly a revolution? And I guess the jury is still out, although I think the initial findings do seem somewhat promising. So recent research by researchers from Chicago and Stanford have actually done lots of surveys, thousands of surveys on people working from home, and have sort of uncovered the fact that they actually tend to be more productive, right? And when they actually parse the numbers together, they actually are suggesting that productivity overall for the aggregate economy might go up by 2.5% to 3% with our post-pandemic remote work situation. So that seems promising. I would just only quickly add that, we might be jumping the gun here. These technologies are, in fact, fairly rudimentary, and they don't necessarily relate to all industries. For those of us who have been teaching remotely for the last year and have tried to interact socially with people in conferences, we need no reminder of this, right? It's been nice to go back to the class. And so we might be jumping the gun here in terms of overall productivity, but so far, things look pretty good.
Great. So you mentioned that, especially Sheboygan, Wisconsin, you see places that have had a lot of automation are also the places that are demanding more services that require, low-skilled labor, and oftentimes those are migrants. So, and Giovanni was kind of speaking about the fact that computerization has kind of not drawn as many people to the low and medium groups of, skilled workers. So I guess, is this driving international migration, or where would these low-skilled workers that are meeting that demand coming from? Are they shifting within the U.S.? I guess how is this, idea of the fact that automated places are actually attracting more low-skilled workers to meet those service jobs? How is that changing immigration patterns internationally or within the U.S.?
Yeah, so let's think about this a little bit. I think first of all, we're seeing a real hesitancy for native workers to sort of return back to work, right? And I think especially those areas that really cannot be done remotely. So I'm thinking healthcare and education, and even manufacturing and construction and so on. Much of the reason, I believe, has to do with the fact that people have now witnessed, or have they at least heard about all the benefits that come from remote work, right? By some estimates, working from home translates into a 6% wage increase. So that just gives you a sense of sort of the overall value that people feel remote work can provide. So, if that is happening, right, I think one thing is immigrants can actually help fill the demand in areas where working from home for people is simply not an option. And that would be a way to kind of propel the economy forward as it sort of rebalances itself. One caveat to that, or one complication, I think, in our let's say new post working from home, post-COVID environment, is there are some challenges here in terms of employing migrant labor. I think one challenge could be the fact that, migrants come and they often reside in enclaves, right? And they're attracted to enclaves. And these are enclaves of people of the same, say, country of origin or same ethnicity. And, there's clear reasons for doing that, particularly if they're relatively unassimilated and they're sort of more comfortable and they're able to get their feet up on their feet relatively quickly. But of course, these enclaves are situated in sort of urban centers, right? And that's, of course, where all the jobs are located. So that makes sense. Now, in the context of where this working from home revolution, if those native workers aren't around there, or they've actually left the cities altogether, that challenges that model, right? This is a model that relies on scale. If corporate parks don't exist anymore, then there's no more buildings to clean. There's no more daycare centers to provide. There's no more food trucks to, service. So the matching of supply of sort of contact-intensive employment with demand, I think, might be challenging. It's not that the demand for such contact-intensive services is dissipating. I just believe it might be distributed more across further geographic, areas, right? And so it's not like demand's going away. So it is simply a complication that maybe policymakers could think about in terms of how do we employ the unskilled migrants in particular in productive ways? How do we match them to demand, which itself is sort of shifting around geographically? Obviously, some policies might include facilitating internal migration among those who had newly arrived to this country. And another maybe less obvious example could be greater resources towards cultural assimilation, right? So that these ethnic enclaves aren't as important anymore. And so the clustering isn't as valuable, in which case then we don't have to rely on the scale too much. But so in general, I believe that, migration should be able to help us rebalance an economy that's seeming increasingly unbalanced, right? This unbalance is often referred to as the cost curse, right? This cost curse is basically, we're in a society that increasingly is productive in areas that we don't demand as much things. Instead, we are demanding things for which we are not that productive, right? So I'm thinking, of course, what we want is quality healthcare. What we want is better education. What we want is, better daycare for our young and elderly care for our aged. And I think what's happening is both automation and this remote work technologies, they have sort of been exacerbating this imbalance. Okay, and I think one thing is, migration can be a big help in this area. And I think this is a situation where both sides of the political spectrum might sort of underappreciate, right? And I might mention one more thing, which is, if we design policies carefully that best utilize the migrants that we currently have and the migrants that potentially are coming to our country, we could potentially get to what John Maynard Keynes had envisioned for us back in the 1930s, when he had suggested that, you and I would be working 8 to 10 hours a week, as opposed to 8 to 10 hours a day, which is sort of what we currently do, right? So we get the best of both worlds. Can we sort of employ all our wonderful robots for all the tech stuff, for all the stuff that we want? Can we employ migrant labor for all the service things that we also want, and kind of get the fruits of both? Now, that might sound rather dystopian to some people, but I find it rather a hopeful model, where we can actually have immigrants come here and climb up the social ladder, and they get their own robots, and we repeat the cycle. So I have a positive vision there, but it's not one I think that will be embraced by any administration anytime soon.
Thanks. So, we're hearing a lot about this polarization in some sense of different skill groups of immigrants. And I'm going to turn to Peter now. You've spoken about, the future of work post-COVID, specifically what you call the future of decent work. So, if we're hearing about this kind of polarization that digitization is bringing into our lives, I'd just like to ask you, you said in this polarization, maybe digitization in the workplace could, increase productivity in some cases, but it might harm or infringe upon the rights of workers in other cases. Speaking to our last panel on data ethics. So what would you call these two digital economies? Kind of what are the pros of digitization and the cons? And how does that affect the decency of work going forward?
Well, to begin with, Giovanni did a terrific summary of the impacts on the labor market. So let me take the lens back and then lower down. We've all been very concerned about the growth of inequality. But if we look at the growth of inequality globally, I do work with the Vatican, so it takes a global view. The greatest growth of inequality in the last 10 or 15 years has been within countries, not between countries. And I want to suggest that a major factor in that development and its escalation during COVID has been the digitization, i.e. the digital divide. And again, both previous speakers talked about aspects of that. And the relevance of that to me is that we have seen during COVID an increase. So you've got the impact of digital technologies playing on top of different previous developments and endowments around skills and education. So in fact, if you were a middle-class professional, your income actually increased during COVID. If you're on the other side of that divide, it fell, employment and income, offset in part by government support systems, which are now ending. So we've seen this longer range trend that has been escalated by COVID. Let me go the lens closer in though and talk specifically about robotics, particularly industrial robotics. So the auto industry is about 13% of industrial GDP, but it's got about 38, 39% of the robots. So it's robot city, if you like. And if you look now, the auto companies are taking the robots out, not putting more in. And to use their language, they're putting in cobots, i.e. machineries and technologies that assist people rather than just to displace them. So this starts to have a very important impact on the conditions of work, et cetera. And an example would be a torque arm that assists a woman assembly worker because she's got to deal with a 100-pound, 125-pound door on the assembly line. That would be one small example. So on the Vatican project, we decided to go deeper on this. So among other things, we looked at 54 global automotive production sites. Because how you produce a car these days or assemble a car these days in Detroit or Torino or Japan or China is basically the same. So we particularly want to look at the impacts of robotics on the decency of work, i.e. how workers were treated, i.e. specifically, and we looked at more than automotive, the torque case was automotive. So what do employers in these now robotized workplaces, highly automated workplaces, what do they want for their workforce? And we found in that is they were working, and this was true from China to Wisconsin. They wanted a workforce that was engaged, trusting, communicative, willing to take risks, learning skills. And at the end of the day, those are all moral virtues. When you look at it, they are looking for an ethical and a moral commitment from workers. Now, those Catholics on this broadcast, I mean, the great change in Catholic moral theology from Vatican II is actually the virtue ethics. So what employers are actually asking of employees and needing from employees is a moral commitment of civic virtues, if you like. So you begin this analysis from a labor market broad scope that Giovanni well summarized and Ahmed has amplified in one particular direction. You begin this with an analysis of broad technology trends, labor market developments. But at the end of the day, you get to a discussion about human nature. And that's why the Vatican particularly gets animated that discussion. Where that ends, and again, this is a particular segment, i.e. those highly skilled industrial workers who have seen benefits arise in their situation in the workplace from robotization, in terms of the case of industrial robots. That's all I'm talking about in this. But the question is, will and can employers return that moral commitment? And I think that's where the bind is. So we've got complex stories of automation and computerization. Some are hitting on the high side, some on the lower side. And the lower side, many of us have now seen Nomadland, the movie, right? Mm. That's actually about dignity, a search for dignity, all right? That's absolutely that's the other part of this story. But in the industrial workplaces, we can see the employers now have certain needs of their employees that require moral commitments at the end of the day. That's a long way from Henry Ford's, $5 a day man in 1912 or something. But will and can the employers return that moral commitment? So I think values comes into this. I am an economist, but I understand all the numbers. But at the end of the day, we get to an issue here about values. That's my initial summary for you.
So, this is obviously, we're talking about a kind of a snapshot of the present, but where do you think these two digital economies, let's say, are going in the future? Is this polarization going to kind of increase? Do you see it getting better? Do you think the positive effects will, in some sense, outweigh the negative effects, or will some groups be left behind? I guess, what do you see morally? What is going to be the net effect going forward, and is it getting worse or better?
Well, morally, just to build on what I said just a few moments ago, I think we saw in the 20th century stage of industrial capitalism, Henry Ford's assembly line become the reference form of industrial organization across the whole economy. I want to suggest for discussion that in the new economy we're looking at, the Amazon fulfillment model is becoming the reference form of industrial organization to be replicated across the economy. That's that's a short summary. That's where the trend line is that I would suggest.
Thanks. So I'm going to turn to Ted now. We've seen in some cases the COVID-19 pandemic has led to a lot of movement of people in some cases, and a lot of halting of movement in other cases. And at the same time that people are being disrupted from moving, we've also seen disruption to supply chains and commerce and the movement of physical capital. So, in a globalized world and globalized labor markets, sometimes we think either people have to move or goods have to move. And in this case, it seems, goods and people have both been prevented from moving, and digitization and innovation have filled some of these gaps. So, can you speak a bit about how the pandemic has impacted international trade and commerce, and how that relates to immigration, and where maybe innovation has filled some of those gaps?
Great. Thanks very much, Jacqueline. It's an excellent and complex question. I mean, I think if you look at the trade piece of this, it's clear that the disruptions were much less significant than on the movement of people side. I mean, global trade has actually recovered to something pretty close to its pre-pandemic levels. If you look at what governments did at the outset of the pandemic, most made this very sharp distinction between the movement of goods, which was deemed essential for the functioning of economies, and the movement of people, which for the most part was deemed non-essential. There were, of course, many exceptions, but for the most part, the movement of people was seen as less critical for the functioning of the economy. I mean, indeed, this distinction got carried so far that there were significant exceptions for the movement of people who were necessary to move goods. If you were a trucker or an airline express pilot, you were still moving back and forth freely across borders, even though there was certainly a possibility that you could be carrying COVID with you. But what you had was governments wanting to ensure that there was an adequate supply of goods to prevent what was certainly a possibility in the early days of the pandemic, which was panic hoarding of one sort or another, people rushing out to buy food and other supplies because they were worried about a global shutdown producing massive shortages. And for the most part, we didn't really see that. I mean, we saw, the toilet paper was hard to get in the early days of the pandemic. There were some more serious shortages of medical equipment at the outset, face masks and ventilators and other things, though they began to ease as the pandemic went on. If we're looking at the current shortages, they're really a function of pent-up demand. Here in North America and Europe and other places, consumers are reasonably flush, partly because of generous government programs, and they're wanting to buy goods, and the system for producing and delivering those goods worldwide is just only slowly kind of creaking back into action. So that explains a lot of what we're seeing now on the shortages on the goods side. The movement of people, it's a very different story. The actions that governments took were far more dramatic. That makes sense, of course. I mean, people are the ones who were carrying COVID, and so there were restrictions on movement, both domestically, but much more significantly and stringently across borders. We all know those restrictions varied significantly. So you had places like Australia and New Zealand and China that were really in total lockdown, very hard for people to move in and out of those countries. The other end, Mexico's restrictions were always pretty mild. The tourist-dependent Caribbean economies, it remained fairly easy to move in and out of those places. The United States and Europe, I would say, fall somewhere in the middle. Though here in the United States, we kept our restrictions in place for much longer. In fact, the travel ban restrictions are only set to be lifted early next month on November 8th. So these actions affected both immigrants and all manner of temporary workers. We are still awaiting a full accounting of the impacts of these different shutdowns. But anecdotally, we know it has been enormous. You had migrant workers across the globe who were ejected from the countries in which they had been working, and in many cases had trouble returning home, had trouble being admitted back to their home countries, or it was expensive to travel and difficult. When you look at Australia, it effectively blocked many of its own citizens from returning. You had European and other visa holders here in the United States who were unable to return home to see families for 2 years because they wouldn't have been able to come back. Even here in North America, at the Canadian and Mexican borders, you had long family separations. China's still largely closed to outsiders. So significant impacts on the movement of people. If you're talking about longer term immigration, again, some significant differences. No question here in the United States, it's had a big impact. I mean, if you look at the data on new arrivals of immigrants. So these are people coming on green cards as opposed to adjusting status here in the United States. I mean, we went from about 250,000 in the first quarter of 2020 to an average of just 25,000 people arriving as immigrants each quarter since that time. There's this huge backlog now of immigrant applications that may take years to work through. Some other countries have done a little better. Canada managed to maintain reasonably high levels of immigration, even despite the pandemic border closures. The immigration minister there says they are on track for a record 400,000 immigrants in 2021. So my summary on this would be that the impacts of the pandemic on trade proved to be fairly modest and transitory. The impacts on the movement of people and on immigration, certainly here in the United States, were dramatic. I don't think we know yet whether those effects are also going to be transitory or whether they will be longer lasting.
Sure. Yeah, and it seems that we all thought it would be shorter term than it is, and we're already approaching the medium term, maybe. So,
yeah, about 2 years now. Yeah.
Yeah, and if if it's been kind of less, if trade has been less affected than migration, do you think in either the case of trade or the case of migration, to what degree has innovation and digitization been able to fill some of those gaps? Like, obviously, it has not, fully compensated, or we wouldn't have seen any disruptions. But I guess, how much worse would it be if we didn't digitize, for both the impacts on trade and migration?
Well, there's no question. I think it would have been a lot worse for the economy. I don't think it's possible to overestimate the impact of these remote technologies. They've allowed many businesses, including, I'm an educator like many of the people on this call, to be able to do our work would have been impossible without these innovations. The interesting thing, I guess, looking forward is do we go back to normal, or does this kind of remote work get integrated even cross-border, right? So, in theory now, companies could hire people from other countries to work remotely for them. There's an awful lot of occupations where you can do that work remote. It's pretty productive. What's this going to mean for employment regulations? Are countries going to allow that? Are they going to allow companies to hire people overseas on different contracts of one sort? What's it mean for wage requirements? We've got domestic wage laws. Can you hire people remotely? Generally these are higher paid people, but issues of sort of wage and working conditions, how do you enforce those across borders? What about taxation? If you've got people working in other countries, full-time for companies here in the United States, what are the tax implications? I think there are a whole bunch of unanswered questions about how we go forward on that front. I do think, unfortunately, on the, this goes back to Giovanni's point about how the legal system, how our laws do not adapt to these situations very well. On the movement of people side, we've seen very little innovation, right? It's taken a long time for countries to start to put in place some kind of mechanisms, for instance, for distinguishing the vaccinated from the unvaccinated. Our immigration laws, I think, are totally unprepared to deal with this situation. Giovanni was talking about how much easier to immigrate here if you're a more highly skilled worker. Well, a lot of those people may be able to work remotely now, may not want to immigrate. The demand will be for the face-to-face services, but our immigration system is not very welcoming to those people. So we may see an exacerbation of the labor mismatches that Giovanni talked about. The other thing I think that's going to be hard to predict is just personal motivation. Right. So the pandemic has raised the possibility, if you make the decision to go and work or study abroad, you could be caught out of your own country for a long time. The potential downsides of those decisions, I think, are much higher. Even think about cross-border relationships, right? It used to be, you fall in love with someone in another country. It's no big deal. If you got the money, you can go visit on weekends and you can travel for long vacations. And I think people are going to be rethinking assumptions that they've lived with for a long time about the ease of cross-border mobility. And I don't think we've yet quite figured out what that is going to mean for how people live and work after we move out of the pandemic.
Yeah, it's definitely making people rethink what's possible. I don't think any of us expected this. So, you talked about now some of those high-skilled people might be able to work in, in their own country and still have the same job and not have to move. So I'm gonna ask you, Ahmed, and where these flows of people have been halted and remote work has allowed us this geographic flexibility, many people decided to return home to their home countries and actually work from there or their home cities. And we hear about brain drain in the sense that skilled people are leaving their hometown or home country. And now we're seeing kind of a reverse brain drain where skilled people are actually returning to their home countries because they can. So Ahmed, could you talk a bit about this phenomenon and how you think it might impact the future of work and immigration?
Yeah, sure, happy to. Economists are, I think, pretty good at imagining worlds in extremis, right? Either through our theoretical modeling or often through basic narrative. So I would think, in my head, I think of a world, a very extreme world, where people with a bachelor's degree or more can work anywhere and never show up for work. And another group of people who have, let's say, an associate's degree or less, who, if they're going to have a job, must be physically present at that job always. And I wonder about, so what kind of world is that, right? Is that a happy world, a dystopian world? What kind of policy implications come from that world? So the very first thing that comes to mind is that surely college graduates are going to be choosing to work in a high wage place, but a low cost place. And we're seeing lots of evidence of that's happening right now. I think also then one considers the possibility of a productivity slowdown, given that we have documented pretty well this idea of agglomeration economies, the fact that highly skilled people working in close proximity with each other is often a big engine of productivity, right? And this is a little bit sort of nebulous how this happens. But it seems like this face-to-face interaction appears to be important, right? And because of potential serendipitous exchanges or sort of the real meeting after the meeting that where like real ideas are being generated. Now, of course, as mentioned, we have technologies that are trying to replicate these face-to-face exchanges. But for those of us who have engaged in them, they're pretty much still a far cry away from those, how important this is. So important, in fact, so Steve Jobs famously put his bathrooms in the building, in the middle of the building, so that sort of engineers over here and software designers over here were forced to interact with each other, albeit some of those interactions might be awkward. At least they created a kind of innovation where none would otherwise happen because if they were sort of isolated away, right? So that's one consideration. And as I mentioned before, it might adversely affect the unskilled service workers as well, who sort of, they want that concentration of people. And the same researchers that I had mentioned before suggested that sort of the shifting of working from home might lower, consumption in urban areas by like 5 to 10%. And much of that is due to the fact of the exodus potentially of these skilled workers leaving city centers. So I would say the global version of this basically might mean, despite this idea that there is potentially, like I said, has been mentioned, a backlog of migrants wanting to come to this country. In the longer run, this might just end up having a permanently depressed effect on migration, right? Because as was mentioned, high skilled workers, right, they can enjoy the fruits of American production in the comfort of their relatively low cost, relatively low tax countries, right? And low skilled workers might have trouble matching their supply of their skills with demand. So consequently, overall immigration, might end up being depressed. Ted had mentioned the fact that there is this backlog currently. So this might be a longer term thing. And were that to happen, I think, for those of us who value the positive spillovers that migrants actually provide, physically coming to the country as opposed to doing the work sort of in a offshore kind of manner, the panoply of their experiences, the energy and drive that they provide to make, have their children have a better life, sort of the fertility kind of spur that they can provide in an increasingly infertile environment. All these things are net goods, right? And I think it would be a shame that we need to appreciate all these things only after they go away. But like sometimes the heart really only grows fonder with absence, and so that might be what is necessary to make us actually appreciate what migrants actually provide. The one final thing I'll simply mention here is that actually in this sort of thought experiment, there could be some other positive things in terms of only the highly skilled being able to work remotely, and which is it's possible that wage inequality might kind of narrow in the upper echelons of the wage distribution. something of some concern to some people. And then also, this might also be a spur to education, right? If education can be provide this extra feature, which allows for geographic mobility, then that might create greater demand for such education. And for some of us, we would think that that's generally a positive.
Thanks. Yeah, I think all of us are kind of wondering what's going to happen as we climb out of the pandemic. What are the effects going to be? Right now, we're seeing kind of a weird phenomenon where we seem to have a lot of jobs available and a lot of mismatches somehow in skill because people aren't taking those jobs. So there are a lot of people unemployed, a lot of jobs, but somehow there's some mismatch. So Giovanni, could you maybe talk about why you think that is? And is immigration a solution to fill some of those gaps, or is it just going to make some unemployment problems worse for Native born Americans, for example?
So what did COVID do? So let me summarize some of the things that have been said to understand the current potentially kind of odd mismatch. So COVID has been said has altered immigration essentially. We have lost 1 year, maybe 2 years of immigrants. And that clearly implies that a lot of the jobs that these people would have come in are gonna have lost that demand. Number two, COVID has shifted twice in an interesting way, demand for goods and services. So first, when we locked down the cities and we started demanding a lot of things that before we didn't. Home entertainment, stay-at-home food, and we have demanded much less of instead the cinema, theater, going to the restaurant. That shifted production, needed to shift production in a way, and so the Amazon system, which has been mentioned by Peter, had to deliver a ton, a lot. And now the second time when we move back, and now we move back to restaurant, we move back to in-person, and it's hard to find. When there are these quick shifts, or rather than quick, when there are these deep and very important shifts in demand, and therefore there is a shift and misalignment between where people work and where demand is, there is always and there is often a bottleneck. There are bottlenecks. In general, migration is a good way to bridge and limit the effect because you can draw from people who come from outside and they have these skills. But this has happened in a period in which people were not coming from outside. So this double whammy, no migration, shift in demand twice, I think has created a lot of these short-run bottlenecks. Now, can migration help the transition? Well, again, as has been said already in the panel by many, by Ahmed, by Ed, by Peter, even immigration would be definitely, it has been the way in which in the past we have often dealt, we have filled some of these jobs, but is immigration also changing going towards the future? Are some of these people less willing, will be the less willing to come, both the high-skilled and maybe the people who also have to do the in-person jobs because some restrictions are going to still there. So I would say these big shifts that COVID has introduced have clearly generated a situation in which I think mobility could help. But one of the problems is that COVID has limited mobility. Will mobility come back? Will people take a better approach to immigration? I think one thing that is done to the common consciousness also in the US is that on one hand has made people more scared of everything that comes from abroad in a way because the pandemic is global, is coming from abroad. On the other though, has made people realize how immigrants are crucial in what have been called the essential sector of the economy, healthcare, distribution, how we cannot operate without immigrants. So in that sense, I think we'll have made people more keenly aware that we do need immigration. How will we go forward in this? In the short run, I think it will be hard to have immigration fill this gap because it's coming back slowly. In the long run, I think will depend crucially on how our government, our policy will respond to this very real pressure. But as Ted said, and as I confirm, I don't have a lot of faith that policy will keep up with the changing world. But I think we should tell people that this is an important part in which we should have better policy and try to have immigration be part of the solution for these issues.
Great, thanks. And I'm going to turn back to you, Ted. What degree do you think that we're going to bounce back? Giovanni is spoken about, things are sticky in the sense that you can't reallocate people between jobs and demand and countries just in a second as quickly as the pandemic's changing. So, do you think we're going to bounce back? And what do you think from the pandemic era is going to stay the same? Do you think we're going to keep certain technologies or certain immigration patterns that are going to be long run effects?
Yeah, I mean, these are really interesting and hard questions. I mean, if you look at past disruptions, you would think that this will probably be temporary. I mean, just to take a sort of proxy, it's not a perfect immigration proxy, but it's a good mobility proxy, which is international tourist arrivals. So, they went down a little bit after 9/11. They went down a little bit in the SARS outbreak. They went down a little bit more in the 2008 financial crisis. But if you look at the curve, it's been steadily up for, pretty much since the Second World War, but dramatically in the last 20 or 30 years. Those proved to be small blips. I mean, things that we talked about at the time as tremendously disruptive and changing the nature of travel didn't turn out to have that effect. So I think it's possible that we will see the same with COVID. Certainly, the procedures, traveling is hard right now, but it will get easier, right? The procedures for verifying vaccinations and other things will improve. And I think it will certainly get easier to travel again. The more interesting question is the one that we've, raised earlier and that we've all been talking about, which is the, change in cost benefit calculations that people have. I mean, one pretty obvious one I think is business travel. I think a lot of companies are just not going to pay for business travel the way they did in the past, right? And business travel is extremely expensive, and there are pretty good remote options. I actually think that means that airline costs are going to go up for the rest of us, because that's how airlines make money, is off of business travel. That allows them to keep the fares low for the rest of us. I think general airfares are going to go up, which will discourage mobility. I suggested I think people will be more scared to relocate internationally. So if I had to predict, I think there will be a long-term depressing effect on both travel and migration, but how significant that turns out to be, I don't really have a particularly good crystal ball.
Yeah, I don't think any of us do, unfortunately. Peter, I'm just going to ask you now, our last question before we turn to the audience is, what can be done to ameliorate this problem? Like, maximize the good parts of digitization and automation and the future of work while minimizing any harm that it might do. So can you speak to maybe anything that could be done to kind of ameliorate this problem of the goods and bads?
Well, on the positive side, what I was laying out in some of the other comments, I mean, having workplaces that build dignity, and dignity is related to productivity, skills, automation done in a certain kind of way. We do have those, we have capacity to frame a new kind of normative expectation for the workplace. And I think that's what's going on. Several other speakers, currently, the great resignation, one, traditionally in labor market economics, you had, voice or exit, and people are exiting. Now, traditionally, voice was associated with unions. Okay, that's a minor part of the ongoing story, but a greater voice, dignity and voice in the workplace are inherently connected. And I'm trying to argue, based on the work that we have done, that actually an enlightened employer knows that they need that. Therefore, you have to, if you like, reconstruct the social contract within the workplace that emphasizes dignity and voice to employees of all levels of skill. That's on the positive side. On the negative side, going back to something I briefly alluded to, at the heart of the Amazon fulfillment model is not robotics, it's pervasive surveillance. The first thing that an Amazon worker does is boot their cell phone. So it's pervasive surveillance, which is a kind of scrutiny in the workplace that exceeds what Henry Ford's assembly line ever done. And that broadens out to what generally is a discussion about surveillance capitalism and how we see surveillance across the economy. And in fact, if it's true, the industrial form is the Amazon model. That has surveillance built right into the guts of it. But it's an additional problem for immigrants, because the whole migration system increasingly looks at pervasive surveillance of immigrants. So they'll have a two-level degree of surveillance. And so I think the legislatures, Congresses are starting to wake up very early innings of that. But it will take, I think, legislative intervention. I don't think the private sector by itself will get there, as we've seen in Facebook. And we have that capacity that goes to the long run voice and dignity of our citizens.
Yeah, I think that's very relevant to the last panel that we had on data ethics, speaking of the fact that, everybody kind of faces privacy breaches, but immigrants have an extra added layer of concern that they have regarding the, vulnerability they face regarding their status. And, the fear that, and we as researchers and also employers, everybody has to kind of play their role to protect privacy, but maybe, as you said, it does take a degree of governmental intervention to place those protections. I think that leads into one of our first questions from the audience here quite well, which is what role, and I'll leave this open to whoever wants to take it, what role do employers play in driving migration, and what happens when employers pay less in benefits or wages to migrants, say, than they would pay to a citizen? Kind of what are the effects? Where does the employer, practices come into play here? I'll leave that to anybody can take that.
Well, clearly, I mean, the dominant business strategy is to increase value added. You can't do that without properly motivating and compensating your employers and have them on career skill development. Because all the debate about minimum wages and such has an awful lot to do with jumping between jobs. There are data that says if you increase wages to a reasonable level, employee retention, morale, and ultimately those contributions to productivity growth are part of that whole package.
Yeah, it brings up. Go ahead.
So I actually have always thought that an immigration system which is heavily based on the responsibility of employer is an excellent immigration system in the following sense. A lot of the reason why employer will want to hire foreigners, and this is very true for high skilled and special skill, but it can be designed to be true also for people who we consider lower education because they have specific and important skill. A lot of reason why they hire foreigners is because to find the right type of skills, the right type of match, and as a consequence, a longer term relationship. So I have in mind the H-1B visa in the US, which has been subject of a lot of critics, but in its best form generates a relationship between the employer and the employee in which the employer wants to invest in the employee, wants to develop the human capital, wants to promote the employee. And in a lot of this kind of knowledge-based, idea-based economy, this is fundamental because innovation comes from diversity, differences of ideas. Innovation comes from employer and employee buying into the same type of productivity project and idea project. So not only all these are things that should go with the dignity of work, but go with the beauty of work, with the creativity of work, with the fact that jobs and a lot of immigrants that take our jobs, that take jobs in the US and contribute to the economy, are people who really are identified, selected for their particular and for their important skills. So I do think that employers should be a fundamental part. They should be clearly regulated and constrained in part in sort of not pushing competition in a way that is hurtful to the worker, but should be encouraged to hire and to be part of the immigration system so that people who come here also adjust, adapt, and integrate in the society where job is a crucial part of this fact. So by all means, I do think that a little bit more economy and a little bit more employers' consideration in the respect of the worker are important in a good immigration system.
I would just very quickly add, and to Peter's point about dignified work, I think we should just make sure that employers, through legislation or other approaches, don't create a two-tiered system where natives are the ones who get the dignified work and immigrants something else. So to Giovanni's point about make sure that it's a longer term relationship, that they are actually vesting and investing in their employees, immigrant or otherwise, I think is a great system. I don't know exactly what the legislation would look like, but I think there are a variety of sticks and carrots that can be implemented to ensure that employers are nudged in that particular direction.
Yeah. I'd add one more point on this to put an edge to it. I mean, Canada has one of the highest rates of immigration in the world. Now, we have had for over 25 years a points-based system, as well as a more generous welfare thing. Frankly, that has allowed us, against the background of a dysfunctional U.S. immigration, has allowed Canadian employers to cherry pick the immigrant labor pool in ways not to be too cynical about it.
Yeah, I think, when we're talking about an employer base, Giovanni, a lot of what you're talking about was also on, skilled worker visas and kind of companies that are willing to invest in people's human capital development but a lot of the, immigrants who are coming in and filling, like we've talked about, essential roles are not always those skilled workers, and employers are not interested in the human capital development of them, yet they're still playing important roles. So, and as we're talking about dignified work, I'm going to turn to another question from the audience here. Somebody asked, can you discuss the, prospects or horizon for labor protections that might be put in place or might not for jobs that are unlikely to be automated away, such as the care industry? Presumably with an aging population, we're going to see an explosion in the care industry, and yet this is not considered a job that people are really willing to place protection. So does anybody have any opinions on or thoughts on where that's going in terms of labor protections for low-skilled jobs?
Peter here. I mean, I don't think we're going to see, we're not going to have robotics where, a robot is chasing granny around. I mean, in the care industry, I think what economists sometimes now call the algorithmic revolution will be more important than robotics, i.e. the nurse at the bedside or the aide at the bedside will be administering drugs and other forms of care, but they'll be doing that against an AI monitoring system where in fact a machine starts to talk in the name of the patient. And the irony of that is that will eliminate a whole bunch of supervision of managerial jobs, but retain the labor jobs. The opposite of what we usually think about automation.
Jacqueline, if I could just add a couple of things. I mean, I do see some encouraging signs on this front. One, if you look at the measures that were passed here in the U.S. during the pandemic for income support, they were much broader than anything we had ever seen in any previous crisis. Substantial additions to the unemployment insurance system. Those were extended to include gig workers and temporary workers of different sorts. I mean, one of the reasons I think the United States has done as well in the pandemic as it did is because a lot of money got put into people's pockets. So we sort of saw those labor protections in a way happening in the context of a crisis. As we see in the negotiations in DC right now over the Build Back Better package, it's hard, there are challenges with extending those, issues like paid family and sick leave, which the Progressive Democrats had been hoping for 12 weeks in the package. It looks like it's going to get whittled down to 4, hopefully not less, but still movement in the right direction. You have states is a big issue in the Virginia governor's race right now. Terry McAuliffe has called for expansion at the state level of paid family medical sick leave. That will really help care workers and others who often don't enjoy those benefits. The other thing that's going on that's interesting, and we'll see how long it lasts, is that workers have some real negotiating leverage for the first time in a long time. We've all paid attention to the fight for a $15 minimum wage. It sort of happened, though, as a result of the market pressures, right? I mean, you see, the McDonald's in my neighborhood now advertising $15 an hour because it's not going to get employees otherwise. So I think we are seeing some real upward pressure on wages at the lower level that I hope will continue, because those are not legal labor market protections in the way the questioner asked, but certainly the potential there for really improving the conditions for lower wage workers in the care sector and others.
Agrees, and I want to add that there is also a real, I think, economic opportunity in some of these sectors, like child care and elderly care. These services are incredibly costly to families, and there is a massive demand for those. And on the other hand, until before the pandemics, the pay in these services, in these areas, has been relatively low. So I think bridging the demand and the supply here, the fact that families are willing to pay a lot for these services, but there is not enough sort of people who will earn a decent money working in these areas in order to match demand and supply. I don't know where the bottleneck is, in part, if it's a restriction, if it's information, if it's a lack of, again, a few immigrant freedom of people to come and take these jobs from abroad. But I think that there are some bottlenecks that are generating pressure, I would say, so that in some of these sectors, wages will have to go up. And so as a consequence, the bargaining power of worker will have to go up. And in some of these areas, I think also immigrants could benefit from this general condition in which some of these services are going to be very important and may command better condition and better pay.
Thanks. I think we have time for one more question and one more answer from it. So I'm going to let one of you guys take it. And we're talking about worker protections and collective. How does collective bargaining play a role? And somebody asked from the audience, what role do labor unions play in this story? Right? How can international migrants be included in labor unions?
Well, you can certainly see in places like New York City, the Construction Building Trades Council making active outreach to include immigrant services and immigrant entry, and recognition of some pathway for undocumented workers. So they're in what would probably be seen in every caricature of a male, white, traditional dominated thing. They're with the Building Trades Council of New York City have signed new contracts that explicitly reach out. Long way to go, but they've started.
I mean, I hope someone else will finish on a more optimistic note, but this is another one of those cases where U.S. laws are a big impediment. It's very hard to organize labor unions in the United States, and efforts to make it easier at the national level have failed because it's seen as a partisan issue. And so I think, unfortunately, labor unions have not been able to play the sort of role they did historically in the manufacturing industry in bringing up wages for those workers. We have not seen a comparable effect in the service industries. Instead, we're seeing, economic forces start to change there. But I wish I could be more optimistic about labor unions again playing a leading role here.
Maybe I'll just jump in and this is not also an optimistic ending, so please let not this be the ending, but having traveled to India recently and having stood in line and had 10 people escort me to the next part of the queue, when in fact a rope could have done exactly the same thing. I'd rather not have unions kind of, solidify those kinds of jobs, but I think unions can play a very important role in the training and the making sure that they are one step ahead of the learning curve when it comes to these technologies. Technologies are relentless, they're ongoing, and I think some kind of organized labor perspective, a strategy, if you will, that is a little bit more, not at the individual level, but at a higher level, can allow workers to keep abreast of the latest technological developments. I think in that respect, labor unions can play a very vital role. So I think they can be used very positively. They can also sort of really distort. And so that's my quick take on it.
Yeah, I just second that positive role. Labor unions have historically played a big role in worker retraining and in that human capital development. And that's one that's absolutely worth building on.
I think that's the positive note we needed to end on. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining, and from the audience for all the questions, including all the good ones we didn't get to answer. There was a wealth of great questions. So this is the end of our session for today. I'll thank all of our panelists and organizers one more time, and please join us tomorrow. We have two panels again, one at 10 and one at 11:25, again, each an hour and 15 minutes. So please come tomorrow and spread the word for people who couldn't come today. So thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Jacqueline.